I never thought I would be the kind of person who could look another human being in the eye and feel absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated coldness. But my husband's parents pushed me to a limit I didn't know existed. They didn't just break my trust or cross a boundary. They deliberately, with smiles on their faces, destroyed the one thing in this world that meant everything to me. And then they expected me to sit at their dinner table and act like nothing happened. When I finally found out the truth, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't throw a tantrum. Instead, I quietly executed a plan that completely shattered their comfortable lives, alienated them from their only son, and left them financially and socially ruined. Now my husband is torn, his extended family calls me a heartless monster, and his parents are begging for forgiveness on their knees, but I refuse to give them an inch. Was I wrong for what I did? Or would you have torn their lives apart too? To understand how we got to this point, you have to understand the kind of people my in-laws, Richard and Eleanor, really are. From the very first day my husband, David, introduced me to them, I felt an underlying current of judgment and hostility. They were old money, deeply obsessed with appearances, social standing, and material wealth, whereas I came from a very modest, working-class background where we measured wealth in love, laughter, and resilience. Eleanor looked at my engagement ring, which was a beautiful vintage sapphire that belonged to my grandmother, with a smirk that practically screamed that it wasn't expensive enough for her son. Richard barely made eye contact with me during that first dinner, choosing instead to talk over me and ask David about his career progression. As if I were just a temporary distraction. David always defended them, telling me they were just set in their ways, and that they would warm up to me once they saw how happy we made each other. I loved David more than life itself, so I swallowed my pride, smiled through the passive-aggressive comments about my wardrobe, my job, and my cooking, and tried my absolute best to be the perfect daughter-in-law. The real tension began when David and I started talking about building a family and managing our future. We worked hard, saved every penny, and managed to buy a modest, beautiful home with a large backyard. I am an avid gardener and an artist. For me, that backyard was my sanctuary, a place where I spent hours planting rare, delicate flowers and building a small, specialized greenhouse. But more importantly, that backyard was where we brought home our absolute world, a golden retriever named Cooper. I rescued Cooper when he was just a tiny, sick puppy who had been abandoned in a box. I stayed up with him for weeks, bottle feeding him, nursing him back to health, and nursing my own soul in the process. Cooper wasn't just a pet to me. He was my emotional anchor, my shadow, and the sweetest soul I had ever encountered. Because David and I had been struggling with unexplained infertility for years. A painful journey filled with negative tests, expensive doctor appointments, and quiet tears at night. Cooper became our baby. David loved him, but my bond with Cooper was deep, spiritual, and absolute. Eleanor and Richard, however, despised Cooper. They viewed dogs as dirty, low-class nuisances that didn't belong inside a proper home. Every time they visited, Eleanor would gasp dramatically if a single golden hair got on her designer trousers, and Richard would making disparaging remarks about how we were wasting our money on premium dog food and vet care, when we should be focusing on moving into an upscale neighborhood. They constantly pressured David to get rid of him, suggesting that maybe my obsession with the dog was the psychological reason we weren't getting pregnant. It was cruel, baseless, and deeply hurtful. But I kept my distance and ensured Cooper was always in his luxurious outdoor run or a separate room whenever they came over, just to keep the peace. Last year, the ultimate tragedy struck our lives, or so I thought. It was just a tragedy at the time. David had to go out of town for a massive, high-stakes business conference that could secure his partnership at his firm. Coincidentally, I was scheduled for a minor surgical procedure that required me to stay in the hospital overnight. We were in a bind about who would watch Cooper. Normally, we used a trusted local kennel, but they were completely booked for a national holiday weekend. Seeing our stress, Eleanor did something completely unprecedented. She volunteered. She called David and, with a voice full of sudden sweetness, told him that she realized how important this conference was for him, and that she wanted to show me that she could be a supportive mother-in-law. She promised they would stay at our house, look after Cooper, water my beloved greenhouse plants, and ensure everything was perfect for when I returned from the hospital. I was incredibly hesitant, every instinct in my gut screaming that something was wrong. But David was so relieved and so happy to see his parents finally stepping up that I brushed my anxieties aside. I gave Eleanor a detailed 5-page list of instructions regarding Cooper's specific diet, his medication for a minor skin allergy, and the exact routine he needed. She smiled, hugged David, nodded at me, and told us not to worry about a thing. The surgery went well, but when David picked me up from the hospital the next afternoon, his face was deathly pale. My heart dropped instantly. He helped me into the car, his hands shaking, and told me through tears that Cooper was gone. He said his mother had called him in a panic just an hour prior, claiming that she had left the backyard gate unlatched by accident while bringing in some groceries, and Cooper had run out into the busy main road. According to Eleanor, he had been struck by a speeding vehicle and died instantly. They had already taken his body to a local pet crematorium to spare me the trauma of seeing him. I cannot even begin to describe the darkness that consumed me in that moment. I felt like the air had been violently sucked from my lungs. I screamed until my throat bled, my surgical stitches throbbing with pain, as a profound, agonizing grief washed over me. When we got home, the house felt entirely empty, cold and dead. Eleanor met us at the door, wiping away fake tears, hugging David, and offering me a hollow, rehearsed apology about how terribly sorry she was for the accident. Richard stood in the background, looking mildly inconvenienced but attempting to look solemn. For the next 6 months, I fell into a deep, severe depression. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and I couldn't bring myself to step into the backyard where my beautiful boy used to chase butterflies. My greenhouse withered away, because I simply didn't care about anything anymore. David did his best to support me, but he was also grieving and trying to manage his high-pressure job. Eleanor and Richard visited more frequently during this time, under the guise of checking on us, but their comments quickly shifted from fake sympathy to aggressive pushing. They started telling David that now that the distraction was gone, we could finally clean up the house, sell it, move closer to their country club estate, and focus on real life. Eleanor even had the audacity to hint that my grief was entirely dramatic and disproportionate for just an animal. I resented them deeply for their carelessness, but I genuinely believed it was a horrific, tragic accident born out of sheer incompetence. Everything changed 3 weeks ago. I was finally trying to reclaim some semblance of my life, so I decided to do some deep cleaning around the house. I went down into the basement storage room to find some old photo albums, and I noticed David's old laptop sitting on a shelf. It was the laptop he used during the time of my surgery, which had been automatically syncing with our home's smart security system and our shared cloud account before he upgraded to a company device. I decided to charge it up, thinking I might find some old videos or pictures of Cooper to comfort me. As I browsed through the automatically archived files from 6 months ago, I stumbled upon a folder labeled Home Security Backup. Out of pure curiosity and a sudden, painful longing to just see Cooper playing in the yard one last time, I opened the video files from the exact weekend of my surgery. What I saw on that screen completely shattered my reality and turned my profound grief into a raging, boiling ocean of pure fury. The security footage from our backyard showed that Eleanor and Richard hadn't left the gate open by accident. The footage clearly showed Richard intentionally walking Cooper out to their luxury SUV on a leash, while Eleanor carried Cooper's favorite bed, his toys, and his food bowls, packing them into the trunk. Cooper was happily wagging his tail, trusting them completely. They weren't panicking. They were calm, organized, and entirely methodical. A few hours later, the camera showed them returning without Cooper, without his supplies, completely empty-handed. They then spent the next 20 minutes intentionally leaving the side gate wide open and tossing some dirt around to make it look like a frantic search had occurred. There was no accident. There was no speeding car. They had systematically kidnapped my dog. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the laptop. I immediately drove to the pet crematorium they claimed to have used, demanded to speak with the manager, and checked their records from that weekend. There was absolutely no record of a golden retriever named Cooper being brought in by anyone matching their names. They had lied about the death, they had lied about the cremation, and they had handed me a random urn of ashes just to cover their tracks. I realized with absolute certainty that Cooper was still alive somewhere, and his own grandparents had disposed of him like garbage just to rid our lives of what they considered a nuisance. So that is the exact situation I found myself in, sitting in my car with a heart full of absolute rage, knowing that my husband's parents had committed an act of pure psychological cruelty against me. I had to make a choice between losing my mind or getting absolute, poetic justice. Before I tell you the twisted way I exposed them and the final revenge I took, I want you to pause right now and comment below what you would have done if you discovered your in-laws did something this monstrous to your family. I didn't confront them immediately, and I didn't tell David right away either. I knew that if I came forward without knowing where Cooper was, they would simply hide him better, deny everything, or claim they gave him away to an anonymous shelter. I needed to find my boy first, and I needed undeniable, absolute proof that would leave them with zero room to escape. I hired a high-end private investigator, pouring a significant portion of my personal savings into it. Within 4 days, the investigator tracked down the truth. Eleanor had paid a distant, low-income cousin of hers who lived 3 hours away in a rural town a substantial amount of money to take Cooper and keep him permanently, under the strict condition that he was never to be brought near our city again. The investigator sent me photos and videos of Cooper. He was alive, but he looked confused, sad and thin, kept in a small fenced pen in a dusty yard. Seeing those pictures broke my heart, but it also solidified the ice in my veins. I coordinated with the investigator and drove down to the rural property while the cousin was away at work. With the legal ownership papers and microchip registration firmly in my hands, and accompanied by local law enforcement whom I had notified about the stolen property, I reclaimed Cooper. The moment he saw me, he let out a high-pitched cry, jumped into my arms, and buried his face in my neck, crying just as heavily as I was. I drove him straight to a trusted friend's house out of town to keep him safe and hidden, because the final act of my plan was about to begin. The following weekend happened to be Richard's 60th birthday, and Eleanor had spent months planning a massive high-society gala at a prestigious local country club. Over 100 people were attending, including Richard's corporate executives, their wealthy neighborhood friends, prominent local politicians, and all of David's extended family. It was the pinnacle of their social calendar, the event where they intended to show off their perfect, affluent life. I told David I was feeling much better, and that I wanted to create a special surprise video presentation for his father's milestone birthday, highlighting his life, his family, and his achievements. David was overjoyed, thinking I was finally healing and embracing his parents. Eleanor eagerly handed over decades of family photos and videos for me to compile into the slideshow. I smiled warmly, thanking her for the opportunity. On the night of the gala, the ballroom was spectacular, glittering with chandeliers and filled with people in black tie attire. Richard and Eleanor were basking in the attention, sipping champagne and acting like royalty. Halfway through the dinner, the lights dimmed, and David took the microphone, giving a touching speech about his father before announcing the special tribute video I had prepared. I stood at the back of the room next to the tech booth, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm. The video began with beautiful classical music, showing old photos of Richard as a young man, his corporate milestones and happy family vacations. The crowd murmured with appreciation, and Eleanor looked over at me with a rare, approving nod. Then at the 5-minute mark, the music abruptly cut to dead silence. The screen flickered and a bold text slide appeared. The true characters of Richard and Eleanor. Suddenly, the crisp high-definition security footage from our backyard began to play on the massive projector screens. The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as Richard walked Cooper to the SUV, and Eleanor packed his belongings. Subtitles I had added clearly detailed the date, the time, and the exact coordination of the theft. The video then cut to an audio recording of the private investigator interviewing the distant cousin, who explicitly admitted on tape that Eleanor had paid him cash to take the dog and lie about it, stating that Eleanor wanted to get rid of the mutt, so her daughter-in-law would snap out of it. The video concluded with footage of me rescuing a thin, crying Cooper from the pen, followed by a final text slide that read, "Happy 60th birthday, Richard. Thank you for showing us who you truly are. Cooper is home, and you are finished." The silence in that ballroom was deafening. You could have dropped a pin and heard it resonate across the concrete. Eleanor's face went from pale to a ghostly, horrifying green, and she looked like she was going to faint right into her expensive dinner plates. Richard stood up, his face turning an angry, violent shade of purple, screaming at the tech booth to shut the video off, but I had paid the technician a hefty tip beforehand to ensure the video ran its full course no matter what. David stood frozen on the stage, his eyes wide, looking at the screen and then looking at his parents in utter, absolute horror. The betrayal in his eyes was deep and agonizing. The elite guests began whispering furiously, shielding their faces, and looking at Richard and Eleanor with complete disgust. Before anyone could even process what happened, I walked up to the main stage, grabbed a microphone from David's limp hand, and looked directly at my in-laws. I told the entire room that a police report for grand theft and animal cruelty had already been filed, that the evidence had been submitted to the district attorney, and that their comfortable, high society lives were officially over. I then looked at David, told him I loved him, walked out of the ballroom, got into my car, and drove straight to my friend's house to hold my dog. The aftermath was a glorious, chaotic landslide. The scandal completely wrecked Richard's professional reputation. Several high-profile clients pulled their business from his firm within 48 hours to avoid being associated with a public animal cruelty and theft scandal, and he was quietly forced into an early, shameful retirement. They were completely blacklisted from the country club and their social circles, turning into local pariahs overnight. The legal system didn't give them jail time because Cooper was recovered safely, but they were slapped with heavy fines, community service, and a permanent criminal record for theft that will stain their names forever. David was completely destroyed by the revelation. He spent 3 days away from everyone, processing the fact that his own parents could commit such a calculated, psychologically abusive act against his wife. When he finally came home and saw Cooper running around our yard, healthy and happy, he broke down in tears. He has completely cut off all contact with his parents, refusing to speak to them, see them, or acknowledge their existence. Eleanor has been calling and texting me from burner numbers, sobbing hysterically, begging me to drop the public hostility, talk to David, and tell the extended family to stop alienating them. She claims they only did it because they thought it would help our marriage and push us toward a better life, and that they never meant to cause this much destruction. Richard sent a formal, typed letter offering a massive financial settlement if I would agree to sign a non-disclosure agreement and reconcile publicly to save what remains of his reputation. I threw the letter in the trash and blocked every single avenue of communication. My extended in-laws are divided. Some say what they did was evil, but that my public execution of their dignity was malicious, vengeful, and completely unchristian. They claim I ruined a family over a dog. But to me, Cooper wasn't just a dog. He was my family, and they tried to kill my soul. I will never, as long as I draw breath, forgive them. Looking back at this entire mess, I realize that some people believe that keeping the peace and turning the other cheek is the noble thing to do. But I firmly believe that when people show you an absolute lack of humanity, you are under no obligation to treat them with kindness. They sowed the seeds of cruelty, and they deserve to reap the absolute harvest of their own destruction. Cooper is currently lying at my feet, snoring softly, safe and loved. And that is the only validation I will ever need. If you think I did the right thing by protecting my family and exposing their evil actions to the world, please hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to the channel right now for more dramatic, real-life stories, and make sure to share your final thoughts on this whole crazy mess in the comments section below. I want to know if you think the punishment fit the crime. Thank you for listening, and I will see you all in the next story.